Welcome to Notes on Power. I'm your host, Tsepo T. Matsimani. Today we are doing our very first live episode with video. So today I have my show notes with me to make sure that I don't miss anything that's important, especially because we're going to touch on a very non-widely spoken about topic, which is power. And power, remember, is something most people don't want to relinquish once they have it. So we're going to talk about power today and why we were never even taught this at school. So let's start first. Why does it matter that we talk about power? If you think about it, power affects every single part of our lives. It affects our jobs, our relationships with people, our relationships with what we do. It affects every single thing. The politics, how water gets into your house, which most of us don't have most of the time. So power affects every single part of our life. So this is why this conversation matters. So let's start here. What are the political definitions of power? To make sure that you understand what political scientists say about power, we'll draw from three definitions of three political scientist authors. The first one will be Robert A. Dahl. The second one will be Max Weber. The other one will be Stephen Lukes. So, how do these three define power? Dahl defines power as A, being able to compel B to do what otherwise B wouldn't do. That's how Dahl defined power. But Max Weber took it a step further, because this is where we see resilience come in. So Max Weber puts power as this: it's the ability to impose your will. To A's ability to impose their will on B despite resistance. Now resistance comes into the fold through Max Weber. But Stephen consolidates the two definitions and makes it one. Stephen defines power in three segments: decision making, agenda setting, and the last one, shaping beliefs. So he defines power as these three pillars: the ability to make decisions, the ability to set agendas, and the ability to shape beliefs. If you listen to our episodes about the three forms of power, you'd understand that this ability to shape beliefs lies in the narrative form of power, the power that controls how societies out to live, out to believe. So, now moving on. Why is power not taught? Well, let's talk about that. Modern power is subtle. It rarely punishes with force, It defines what's normal because it controls the narrative, obviously. But here's the most painful thing. Our educational systems weren't built to create power analysts. They were just built to create workers to produce the results that needed to be produced within a particular production line. So, by understanding this, we'll understand that none of the educational systems that exist intended in teaching people how power works, what type of powers exist, and the likes. So, we'll move on. knowing very well that systems thrive to preserve stability. And this is particularly because institutions prefer predictability, you know. When you know people are going to behave in a particular way, you can then plan around that. You can then also discover the risks that needs to be mitigated along the way. That's why power loves stability, and together with that, institutions prefer that predictability that comes with stability. So, what happens when people understand the narratives or how the narratives are constructed? What happens then? Because awareness somewhat becomes key in these factors. So we'll get into that now. It's important to understand it because when awareness comes into the key, it becomes destabilizing for power. Once people start being aware of the loopholes in power, the unfairness in power, the segregation in power, then they will understand how to destabilize that, you know. So now we'll get to the three forms of power so that we understand in a deeper context how this operates in our society. The first type of power is known as coercive power. We all know this power as it is in a form of military, police. It's the type of power that's enforced by force. Here they don't beg you, they tell you or they make you do whatever it is that they need you to do. But this is the most unstable form of power. As you'll know, when there's too many unrests, when there's too many protests, nothing really works in that particular country. Neither for the police, neither for the government, neither for the people either. So most powerful people shy away from using this form of power to get legitimacy. The second form of power is institutional power. These are just procedures, gatekeeping. They decide who gets funding, who gets accreditation, who gets media coverage, who gets promoted. They decide. This is the type of institutional power that exists, which is in the form of our governments and our states all over the world. This institutional power gets to shape options, our options. It gets to shape our options without visible force. Now, before we move on, why do we comply with these invisible forces being used by institutional power? Well, we comply because in our minds, that's just how things have always been. So why rebel against that? It's the law. It protects all of us. At least that's the narrative we've been told. So now we move on to the third form of power. This one is the one that powerful people actually love. Ideological power. Examples of it are success narratives, meritocracy, myths, economic assumptions, political framing, as you would know. Since where we live in, which is South Africa, there's a number of political parties which constantly give you or us their ideologies of how to take South Africa forward. So this type of power is ideological power, the third form of power. And this is dangerous. Why? Because if people believe the system is natural, they defend it. As you would know, we defend the ANC's defects, we defend the DA's racism at times, we defend the VF Plus, These are examples, by the way. I stand to be corrected. But when you believe in a narrative enough, you start to defend it and you think it's okay to do so. We can even take the USA-Israel matter right now. You know, those who defended are particularly defending genocide, you know, but that's my opinion. But those who support it will also say they are supporting whatever narrative it is that they are supporting. That's how it is. So, why is understanding power liberation? Let's talk about that. When we understand power, we allow ourselves to sit down and strategize on how to navigate inside it, and once we have it, how to navigate with it. In this way, our awareness prevents these very powerful narrative systems to influence or manipulate us in a way we would otherwise not want to be manipulated. When we understand coalition building, we understand that we are building a nation not for ourselves, but for everyone that lives in it and for even our future generations. As most of us might have kids, when you start to sit down and think, what type of a world or what type of a country do I want my kid to live in tomorrow? It affects you in a way that you start wanting to think about ways on how to strategize in a way that your kids will be able to also survive and also contribute better in the future of any country, and our country in particular, and the globe. The next thing, knowing where influence is allows us to flow towards the corridors of power. Once we know who influences what, who makes decisions at the higher echelons of power, then we start moving closer to those corridors of power. But we cannot move close to those corridors of power without understanding what power is, how it works, and how it functions in our daily societies. Power literacy, however, don't get me wrong, it's not about hating systems. It's about navigating those systems in an intelligent manner. Doing so will not only allow us to contribute towards changing or transforming the systems that suppress our people, but it will also assist us to gain seats in those echelons of power where higher decisions are made about the future of our country. So, who shapes our economic opportunities? Let me ask you that. Who decides what news you see? Who defines what success looks like? Who sets the rules at your workplace? Mapping those relationships might be the first critical step we might take towards understanding power. So as I will also sit down and answer those questions, I will get a map of who holds power in the spaces I move in. And it's important, and remember, I said, knowing or understanding power has nothing to do with systems. It has more to do with navigating the system or the systems intelligently. So, our homework, living it with you and myself as well, is to map power in our own lives. Identify invisible versus visible power. Study institutional structures. our governments, all our institutions, our departments, study them. But while we do that, we also need to build skills that will increase our leverage. And then we make all of that actionable. So, to bring it into full circle, ignorance of power will create vulnerability in our lives. So with that being said, if power operates whether you understand it or not, which position is stronger? Awareness or innocence? I'm leaving you with that powerful question to ponder before our next episode next week. So, let me land this plane. Why did we learn about power? Why did we think it was important for us to understand what power was or is? It's because power affects every single part of our lives. That's why it was important for us to understand what power is. And in this episode, we also learned that there are 3 forms of power: coercive, institutional, and ideological power. But with that, we also understood that by understanding how to navigate these systems intelligently, this is not a sign that we hate the systems. It's a sign that we want to understand them so that we move inside them intelligently. And if we are to change any parts of the systems, we cannot change something we do not understand. And quite frankly, you can't understand something you start at with hate. So, instead of being hateful, we will seek to understand. Instead of being angry, we will organize intelligently. Instead of feeling like we are victims, we will build skills that will give us leverage so we are confident in our abilities. This was the first Notes on Power live video episode. It won't be edited, it won't be cut. I'm human, so I guess we all are. If you're not, sorry for you. It feels great to be human. So with this being said, till the next one, the conversation continues. This was Notes on Power. I'm your host, Tsepo T. Matsimane. From now on, all of our podcast episodes will be on video. But if you prefer to listen without watching, you'll also find it on Spotify, on YouTube Podcast, and on Apple Podcast. Thank you for listening. Till the next one. Peace.